Hello and welcome to another Talk to Stu with me, Stuart Magoo. In this session we are going to be looking at care funding. So it may be that you or someone you care for is looking at receiving care in their own home or possibly moving into residential care on either a temporary or permanent basis, and you want to look at how that might be paid for. Depending on which local authority you're with, you can receive a financial assessment from social services, whereby social services will look at your income as well as your capital and then decide whether or not they will fund some of the care costs, if not all of the care costs, that you are likely to incur. Now, even though I say all of the care costs is never actually the case. There will always be something that either you or the person you're caring for has to pay. So this will, for most people, be something that comes along at a time where people are post-retirement pensioners, essentially. So we'll mainly be talking in those terms, but it may be that this applies to people of a younger age as well. Now, what we're going to look at today is basically what makes you eligible for a financial assessment, also other things that people are concerned about, such as does your property come into the assessment as well. And I'll be looking at a couple of the pitfalls too. I'll do a separate video on personal budgets and things like that later on. This is mainly just about the financial assessment. Okay, so the first thing to do when it comes to looking at a financial assessment is to work out whether or not you're eligible. Now, the eligibility criteria tends to vary from local authority to local authority. So the information that I'm giving you is based on the Worcestershire local authority. What you'll need to do is go to your local authority's main website and find out what their eligibility criteria is. Now, I'm just going to quickly check on my computer in the background. The basic search term that I put into Google was Social Services Financial Assessment Worcestershire, and that led me to the Worcestershire County Council financial assessment page, where they had documents that I could download which showed the eligibility criteria and also the different pay bands and how they calculate it. So you'll be able to do the same most likely from your local authority. Okay, so how it works in Worcestershire is you have a upper limit of capital and a lower limit of capital, where the contributions of social services are calculated on a sliding scale between these 2 points and then afterwards. So the upper limit is £23,500. So if you have £23,500 in capital or more, then you would be what's known as a self-funder. So basically you would pay for everything yourself until your capital drops below the 23,500 mark. At that point, then social services will begin to contribute towards your care costs. Okay, now the lower end of that, again, this is just for people in Worcestershire, is 14,000. Okay, so there's a sliding scale between 23,500 and 14,000 at the bottom, at which their contributions are calculated. When it drops below 14,000, then the council, the local authority, will fund your care, or will fund the lion's share of your care. A little rhyme there for you. So they will fund the lion's share. You will still always have to pay a certain amount towards your care, as I said before, and this will most likely come out of a pension, and if you're receiving it, a tenants allowance. Okay. So what counts as capital? That's the key thing. So if you're receiving care and you're living at home, then all they're going to be looking at is your savings. They're not going to be looking at the value of your house at this stage. If you're receiving care while you're at home, you don't have to worry about the value of your house. Okay, at least not at this stage. That may change in the future, so it's not a given that it will always remain that way. There was an attempt by the Tories probably about 4 or 5 years ago to get people to have the value of their house assessed as part of their financial assessment while they were living at home, and to use a deferred payment, which I'll talk about later, what deferred payments are, to use the deferred payment against it. This was generally referred to in the press as the dementia tax, although it would have applied to anybody, even people without dementia. So yeah, it's not that they're not thinking about it, and we'll probably try and find some other way of doing it, but at the moment it's not on the table. So the value of your house, if you're receiving care while you're living in your house, with carers coming in to provide that care for you, in whatever way, shape or form that occurs, if you're in your house, the value of your property is not considered as part of capital. Okay. However, should you need to move into permanent residential care, your house may be included in that assessment. Now, this next point is really, really, really important for people to know. Okay, so if you're living on your own at home and you need to go into residential care, then it's very likely that they are going to look at the value of your house. If you own your property, of course. If you're in rented accommodation, it won't apply. But if you own your house, they will then expect that house to be assessed in the calculation. Okay, so what that means is if you've got a house that's, say, worth £150,000 or more, then that capital will come into the assessment. Now, as you recall, we said the upper limit was £23,500. So what social services or your local authority will expect at that point is for you to attempt to sell the house in order to pay for your care. Now, they give you a little bit of leeway to do this, which they call the 12-week disregard. So for the first 12 weeks, they won't charge you for that care that you're receiving. Okay? So this gives you little breathing room to be able to sell the property. Now, of course, most people know that a property sale does not go through in 12 weeks. 12 weeks is a very, very optimistic assessment of how quickly a house can be sold. And indeed, it'd probably take 12 weeks just to move all of your stuff out of it to get it ready for people to come round and even view the property. So they've come up with what they call a intelligent solution to this, which is, of course, deferred payments. Okay, now deferred payment is essentially a compound interest loan against the value of your property. Okay, so what you need to do is get that property sold as quickly as possible in order to not fall foul of the deferred payment. Okay, compound interest is not a good thing. It is very expensive over time. So the quicker that that property is turned into capital, as in actual cash in the bank, the better for you. Now, you've not really got any way out of this at all. Okay, it has to be done in most cases. So let's look at some of the exclusions as to when the property itself may not be included. So the first and most common exclusion, if a husband and wife are living together and say the husband has to go into care because he's developed dementia, along with a number of other conditions, and the wife can't cope with caring for him at home in between the times when the carers come in to support him, it may be seen that actually now he needs to go into care as a permanent solution to that problem. Okay, so if the wife is still living at the property, then the property is not included in that assessment. Okay, so the husband's capital will just be about the capital that he has in his bank account and capital that he shares in a joint account. Okay, so if a husband and wife have joint savings together, then they will literally divide that in two in terms of their calculations. If the husband has capital kept separately in his own bank account, his own savings, then that will be assessed in full. Okay? What you have to consider as well is deprivation of assets. So now I've told you those things, you might think to yourself, well, why don't we just move all of the savings that is in mum and dad's name just into mum's name? Well, that would be called deprivation of assets. So you're not allowed to do that. Okay, so don't do that. But it is really important to note that the house itself is not included in that financial assessment. Now, the reason this is really important is because a lot of people, when they're sort of aware that they're getting old and they've got capital that may come into a financial assessment in the future tied up in their home, they might start looking at ways of protecting that investment. They want to leave it to their children. They want it to be passed on as inheritance, and that's very fair. We'd all feel the same way. So they might look into different ways of doing it, such as tying it up in some form of trust, or more commonly, they may use a legal system that's called tenants in common. Okay, now this often gets suggested by people, by solicitors usually, who don't really understand exactly how the care system works. So I strongly encourage people to avoid setting up as tenants in common. Let me explain why. Tenants in common is essentially where two people own a house together. Okay, you jointly own that house. Tenants in common splits that ownership into two separate parts. So you each separately own half of the house. Okay? Sounds good, doesn't it? That means that only Mrs. Jones has to pay for her care and Mr. Jones has to pay for his care out of their share of the value of the house. So that sounds really good. That means that Mrs. Jones doesn't have to sell her house when Mr. Jones goes into care. Except that's not the case, because you don't have to sell your house when Mr. Jones goes into care, Mrs. Jones, because that's protected already in the rules. So what's actually occurring is what you've done is you've made that half of the value of the house now eligible as part of the financial assessment because it entirely belongs to Mr. Jones. So you shouldn't do that, because what that means is now that has to be included in the financial assessment, and because the property can't be sold because Mrs. Jones is still living in it, they will have to put a deferred payment loan against Mr. Jones's value of the property. Why is that important? Well, Mrs. Jones would have to sell the house to avoid the deferred payment in that situation. If she doesn't want to sell, which I'm sure she doesn't, she will have to have that deferred payment put against the value of the house. And as I've said, it's a compound interest loan, so that's not really financially very sensible thing to do. Now, I'm not giving you financial advice, I'm just saying that this is what could happen. So if you're already in a situation where you signed up with tenants in common, there's not really any way of reversing that that I'm aware of. There may be. Talk to your solicitor about it if you still both have mental capacity and you think that that might be something that trips you up in the future. then maybe speak to a solicitor about whether or not that can be reversed. That's up to you, as I say. But if a person is still living in the house, it won't be considered in the financial assessment. So putting somebody down as tenants in common actually does you more harm than it does good. Now, in terms of trusts, if you were to put your money into a trust, that might seem like a good way of doing it. You know, that capital is in a trust, it's for the children, it's not for you. Social services don't like that at all. They call that deprivation of assets. Okay, now when I say social services, what I mean is the government. Okay, it's not social services or social workers that are taking this money from you, it's the government. They're forcing you into putting your money into the hands of private profiteering health companies that run care homes, like Care UK and Virgin Care and people like that. Those are the guys who are going to get your inheritance, not your children. And they've made laws against it. So if deprivation of assets gets pulled out of the bag when you've got something in a trust, then it won't be that they charge you with fraud or anything like that. It will simply be a case of they say, we're not paying for your care. That's all there is to it. So you then have to go through the expensive process of undoing that trust and getting access to that money if indeed you are to look at paying for care. Basically, there's not really any way out of it. Now, there has been talk of time limits, like if you do it 7 years before or 10 years before, then it doesn't count, but that varies with different local authorities, and generally speaking, they will find ways around it if they can. And simply put, they'll just say, no, we're not funding your care. So that's a very difficult issue. Okay. Very important to remember. Now, top-up fees. Now, here's another little pitfall for you. So with the top-up fee, it may be that, particularly in the case with people with dementia or people that have very specific conditions that require care, that there isn't a care home that's available that suits your needs, that's within the social services funding bracket. Okay, social services will pay a certain amount towards care home fees, and it is extremely low. The average care home fee is about £1,000 a week all across the country, much higher in London, and yeah, not easily afforded. Now, if you speak to a care home provider, they will break down the costs for you and say, well, it costs about this much for this, and it costs that much for that, and so on and so forth, and that adds up to £1,000 a week. Well, of course, anybody who's worked in the industry for a length of time knows that this is rubbish. And actually, the true cost of a person staying in a care home on a weekly basis is around the £300 to £500 a month mark, and pretty much 500 plus of that is just in profit for the care home. Now, some care homes will justify this by saying, wow, we spent a lot of money on building the care home and it cost us £5 million to build this care home, so we need to make that money back. Well, that's true, but they've usually made the money back within 3 years. Do they reduce their costs after that? No, of course they don't. So, what will social services pay on average towards that? Well, it's increased a little bit in the last few years, but generally it's between £500 and £750. £500 and £750, not £5, that would be ridiculous. So yeah, you can see that there's quite a large shortfall just on the average care home, let alone one that has extra specialist requirements for the care that they provide. So you might be looking at a bit of a top-up that needs to occur. But here's the thing. Most local authorities don't actually have enough provision of these kind of specialist care services. Okay, so what they say is there's a rule within most local authorities that says that if you choose to go into a care home that is more expensive than they're prepared to afford, then you can only do that if a family member pays top-up fees. Okay, Now, top-up fees and social workers and social services are a bit of a nightmare because actually top-up fees don't have to be paid. And there's a couple of reasons why you don't have to pay top-up fees. First of all, top-up fees are not paid by the person who's going into care. Top-up fees have to be paid by another family member. So that could be their husband or wife, or it could be their children. Well, that might sound all right to start off with. You know, can you pay top-up fees for your parents at £250, £300, £400 a week? What if your parent lives for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years while they're staying in residential care? That's going to add up to being extremely expensive. Okay, so think very carefully before you agree to paying top-up fees. Now, if your loved one who's going into care, or you, requires a specialist type of support that can only be found at a certain care home, and social services says, but we don't pay the full whack for that care home, we want you to pay the top-up fees for that, then you're not really having a choice, are you? You're not choosing to be in that care home. It's just the only care home that's available to you. So what at this point you should be saying is, we're not paying those top-up fees. You have a duty of care to provide the right care for my loved one, for the person that I'm caring for. So you will have to find the money to cover that, because we're not paying it, because why the hell should we? It's not our care, it's their care, and you have the duty of care, legally speaking, to provide that for them. Okay, so if you are making a choice, if you're saying, well, actually I want to stay in this care home because I don't like the look of that one, I'm assuming that because this care home charges less, that it's going to be of a lower quality than this one that charges more, which isn't usually the case. But if you think, no, that's the care home that I want to, and there's no reason that you have to go to that care home particularly, then yeah, maybe arguably the top-up fees would be necessary in that situation, because you are making a choice to do something that wasn't actually recommended by social services. Okay, so if you can go into any care home because your care needs are actually fairly basic, you're just not physically able to provide them for yourself when you're living at home, and they go over and above what 3 to 4 visits from carers would actually deliver in a day, then, to be honest, it is a question of choice, and then really you should go with what social services are offering. However, if it is that there's no choice involved for you, that there's only one care home, then refuse to pay those top-up fees, because you've got no requirement to do so. Don't be browbeaten into doing so. Okay, they will lay it on thick sometimes to get people to agree to this, and you should be very careful of that. Okay. So, when it comes to thinking about how do I kind of muddle my way through all of this, the best thing to do is to get as much knowledge as possible. Now, if you are in the area that you are living, there may be a local Age UK who could advise you on the specific ins and outs of the care system within your area, and what the ins and outs are of the financial assessment scale that your local social services will be engaging in. They'll be able to explain that to you in a lot more detail and help you work through it, depending on what services they are offering. Sometimes they only give general advice depending on where they are and the availability of their information and advice officers. But often they can go into a lot more detail, so it's worth getting in touch with those guys. In addition to that, there are other organisations out there who will advise on that, and I'll post some links in the description below, so do have a look at those. They can be quite helpful to sort of navigating the whole system. Remember, you are essentially in charge of this situation as much as they are. Okay, that's important to remember, particularly if you are power of attorney for somebody and you are exercising the health and well-being power of attorney as well as the financial power of attorney. When you're looking after somebody, you have to be in agreement with everything. If you don't feel comfortable with something, you think something is maybe they're trying to pull a fast one, or they're not giving you all the information, trust your gut and ask for more information, push back against what's being said to you. I've seen many times where clients of mine were placed in care homes that were just not suitable for them or their health conditions, because essentially there wasn't really any bed availability anywhere else. What's really important to remember when talking about moving into care or receiving care at home, but particularly moving into care, everyone has this idea in their head that they're going to be sent into care, that social services want to send them into care, that Age UK would want to send them into care, that the hospital would want to send them into care, and that just isn't true. Okay, no one wants to send you into a care home. In fact, getting people into a care home when they absolutely need to be in a care home is very, very difficult, because there's not a bed availability, particularly for specialist conditions like dementia. And on top of that, it's too bloody expensive. So all of the time, social services are looking at ways of getting out of spending that money if they can. Okay? It's just so that they can keep their budgets as low as possible. So quite often the case is actually that you have to fight for the person you're caring for, if not for yourself, to be placed into the right care home that gives the right level of support and security in some cases. Okay, so that's the challenge. No one wants to put you into a care home because there aren't really enough beds for you. So generally speaking, don't worry about that. You'll stay in your home for as long as they can possibly keep you in there. Generally speaking, if you have to go into care, it's usually end of life stuff, and it's usually, not always, but quite often after a person has lost mental capacity, usually with dementia, something like that, where they're just not well enough or safe enough to be in their own home. Okay, and that decision is usually taken out of the hands of you, if you're the person caring for someone else. It's taken out of the hands of the family altogether. The doctors and social services will say, it's time. Unfortunately, it's not something that you will necessarily have to make a decision about yourself. It will be a question of them saying, look, we've got to the end of the road here, and this needs to happen to make sure that this person has a reasonably cared for exit out of this thing we call life. So yeah, quite often people feel like there's a lot of pressure on them to make that decision and stuff, and actually when it comes to it, that decision is usually made by somebody else. So that in a nutshell is everything you need to know about this. Now, I didn't cover NHS continuing healthcare, which I will do in another video, which will be going up at the same time as this one, and there should be a link on the screen to that. So that will be looking at whether or not you qualify for NHS continuing healthcare, and again what the pitfalls are with that. So hope you enjoyed this video. Like I say, like, share and subscribe if you did like it, if it did help you. I will post more videos. I don't come out with them very frequently, but they do come out. Obviously I'm using this microphone today. People were saying we can't hear you properly, so I've used this thing, but I don't know if it's any good or not, so do let me know in the comments. Obviously share your experiences in the comments as well. It does help other people who watch these videos and maybe just need to get a little bit more information about what's happening in those areas. And it's good for me to know as well, because obviously my experience is within Worcestershire and you may live in another local authority and have had different experiences. So please do let me know, and yeah, tune in for the next one. Thanks very much for listening.